Okay, welcome everybody to TESOL 2250. We're going to talk a little bit today about mood, and this is the last thing that we're going to add to our verb status as we've been putting those on our tree diagrams lately. So we have a variety of different purposes for communicating or for any kind of sentence that we're going to create. So we can, for example, make a statement such as Polynesians ruled Hawaii until 1791. Now, this is just what we call an indicative statement. We're indicating a fact or an assertion. But we can also use language to make a question. So we can ask a question like, why does cancer frustrate microbiologists? Or we can use language to make a command, such as if I say, turn in your homework by the start of class on Monday. Now, the last mood that we're going to focus on today is the mood that we use to indicate a possibility or an eventuality or a conditional. So this is shown in the sentence, we may see whales on the boat today. Now here, this introduction of this may introduces what we call a conditional. If the conditions are right, we will see whales on the boat, but we may not. So this particular mood is called the conditional mood. So we make sentences have the conditional mood by adding a modal auxiliary. Now, as you recall from a few weeks ago, we talked about modal auxiliaries. These are words like may and should and must and might and could and shall and so on. So everything that's in this chart that you see here is going to be very important. These are all modal auxiliaries. And these are verbs that attach to the main verb and express possibility or imperativeness, or most importantly, a hypothetical or unreal situation. Now, this is going to be important, and I'm going to say this a lot. Modals actually have tense. And it may seem a little bit strange to think of modals as having tense, but you're going to have to just memorize this chart that you see here, where we have some base forms, or what we call present forms of a modal, and then we have the corresponding past form. So for example, can is what we call the present tense form of that modal, and it has a corresponding modal, could, which we label as past. Now, this may seem a little bit confusing that modals would have tense, and I'm going to show you in class how it is that modals have tense, although it may not seem quite correct to you. So for now, we'll just put that aside, and I'll kind of explain the tense with modals a little bit more in class. But let's look at some examples of modals in a sentence. So I have the sentence here, I may eat lunch with my parents tomorrow. Now, this is a conditional mood sentence because it may or may not happen. I'm expressing a hypothetical situation or an imagined situation in which I'm eating lunch with my parents. Same thing here. I should call my mom. Now, if I say I should call my mom, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to do it, just that I'm expressing some sort of obligation. So it's important to note, again, on our chart here, we see the corresponding present and past forms of each of these modal pairs, except for must. Must is always going to be considered to be in the present form. So when we add a modal auxiliary, what we need to remember is that tense is always going to shift to the leftmost auxiliary away from the verb head. In other words, the first auxiliary verb that you read. And if you have a modal auxiliary, that will always be the very first auxiliary verb that you read. So modals will always carry the tense because something has to carry the tense. And if the modal is the first thing that you see, that is what's going to be carrying the tense. So let's take, for example, this sentence here. I may have eaten. Okay, so here what we see is that we have may carrying the tense. Now, may carries the tense. We say that's going to be present tense for may. If we say I might have eaten, we're going to say might carries past tense. Again, going back to that chart in the previous slide. Now, again, we realize that these modals sound kind of strange as having tense, but they do. May and might have tense, because if we look at the previous versions of the sentence that don't have a modal, we'll see that the tense just shifted to the left onto the modal auxiliary. So if I say, I have eaten, have is what's carrying the tense now. And that's why we know that we can change have to had in some instances. I had eaten. So we see that the tense is carried on auxiliary have. Now, if we go to a very simple sentence like I eat or I ate, here we've only got one verb, and that is the verb that's carrying the tense, eat and ate. Now we see the tense is going to move every time we add a new auxiliary. And this is why auxiliary verbs like modals have to carry the tense, because these are always going to be on the outermost layer as we add more verbs out from the central verb. Everything after the auxiliary verb is going to be in an infinitival form. So this is another non-finite form that we have not yet seen. It's called infinitival. Now, infinitival means infinite or no tense. It's another word for base form. So let's see where we see this base form here. Well, we see it in have on the last sentence. I may have eaten. Now, have is in a base form. Notice it doesn't have any suffixes on it. It doesn't look like had. It doesn't look like a participle form. It's just a regular old base form of the verb. And there's no tense on have. So this is yet another non-finite form, along with the past participle and the present participle that we saw with auxiliary be and auxiliary have. Now, this should be pretty familiar to us at this point in time, because we have already examined auxiliary have when it comes to aspect. So if I say I have eaten, we're going to notice here eaten is in this form. And if you think back to what form that is, that's a past participle form. Here, now we have a new non-finite form, which is the infinitival or base form. And this is what we see immediately after modal auxiliaries. Okay, so that's one more thing we need to add to our list. If we see a modal auxiliary, it forces the verb after it to appear in infinitival or base form. So, we've been talking about tense and how we only really have two tenses, past and present. We don't have future tense. And you might be wondering, well, why do we not have future tense? I mean, certainly we can talk about things in the future, but let's think about that for just a minute. The future is always uncertain. And when we're talking about uncertain or imagined situations, what do we use? We don't use a tense. Tenses are for certain events. Instead, we use a mood. We use conditional mood. So once again, if I have a sentence like this, Radiohead will perform in the Civic Auditorium on Friday. Well, will seems pretty certain in a lot of cases, but it may or may not happen. We're talking about a future event. Any number of things could change, and maybe this performance could be canceled. So as a result, because of the inherent uncertainty of the future, we don't use tense to express future. We use mood instead, the conditional mood. That is, that if all the conditions are correct and all the conditions are right, then Radiohead will perform at the Civic Auditorium, but it's not certain. So whenever we have can and shall and will and may and must, and then we have some other main verb after it, we say that these are present conditional forms. And we're going to add that to our tree. If we have could, should, would, or might, and then we have a main verb after it, we will call these past conditionals. And once again, we'll add both of these things to our verb status, but we'll do that again in class as practice. So we have a lot of practice trees to diagram that we're going to do in class. I want you to start working on these this week before you come to class on Friday and see how far you can get. We're going to do, I should call my mom. We could have walked. The old man may be taking his time. They might have been watching a movie yesterday. Humidity can make my dog uncomfortable. Communism seems to be dying throughout the world, and your sister might want to calm down. So these are a little bit challenging. The last two of these are going to actually be in your quiz. So try to diagram as much of these as you can. If you get stuck somewhere, just put a circle around that, and we're going to go over that in class on Friday. So now we're going to add the last thing into our verb status. So far, we have added tense, and if there's aspect, we've added aspect as well. Now, if you see a modal auxiliary, you're going to also add mood too. So the order of your verb status is going to be tense, then aspect, then mood. And we'll practice doing that a little bit in class on Friday. Now, there's one other thing we want to add to conditional mood, and that is semimodals. Now, semimodals are exactly what they sound like. They're kind of like a modal auxiliary. They have some properties of a modal auxiliary, but they're not exactly a modal auxiliary. They do things that modals can't do. So here are some examples of semimodals: used to, dare to, ought to, need to, happen to, want to, be able to, have to, and seem to. Now, what you're going to notice is all of these semimodals have this to on the end of them. And at one point in the grammar, to was actually analyzed as part of the verb that was following these semimodals. And over time, these semimodals have kind of absorbed the to, and it's no longer a preposition. It's now what we call a verb particle, just like we've seen with phrasal verbs. So the interesting thing about semimodals is that their pronunciation actually reflects how to no longer goes with the verb after, but rather goes along with the verb before. So for example, let's take this, want to. Nobody ever says want to. I want to eat. No, they're going to say something like, I want to eat. Wanna. Same thing with have to. Nobody says have to. I have to go to class. They're going to say, I have to go to class. And you'll even see people writing it HAFTA and wanna, WANNA. So we can really see from this pronunciation that in the speaker's minds, these two words have kind of been conjoined into a single unit and are parsed as a single unit in speakers' grammars. So we look at semimodals, and these actually occur before the main verb constituent, just like any other modal would. So, for example, I can say, I happen to hear that the last part of your song. Or I can say, I want to like you. Maybe I don't. I want to like you. But notice that that want to comes right before the central verb. So I can say, I may like you. We can put a modal there instead of want to. You ought to go to the dentist. That can kind of replace you should go to the dentist, or you need to go to the dentist, or you have to go to the dentist. And the interesting thing about modals and semimodals is they're kind of gradable. So, for example, if I say you ought to go to the dentist, I'm making, kind of a weak suggestion. It's nothing really major. However, I say you should go to the dentist. Well, now it's a little bit stronger. If I say you need to go to the dentist, it's definitely a very strong suggestion. However, even if I say that, you may not go. Similarly, if I say you have to go to the dentist, it's a very strong suggestion, but you still may not go. And I want to point out that this is not an imperative, but rather it's a very strong suggestion. So semimodals and modals are going to give you these kind of gradable suggestions in many cases, but all of these situations are always hypothetical or are non-real situations. You may or may not follow through with the action. So just like when we add a modal, when we add a semimodal, the tense is going to shift to the left, and it's going to shift onto that whole semimodal. So, for example, if I have a simple sentence like I eat, and I want to add a semimodal, I'm going to get I have to eat. Well, the tense is just going to shift from eat right onto have to. And you're going to notice that eat in all of these instances is yet again in the infinitival form or the base form. And that's what we would expect, because we expect to find infinitival forms of verbs after modals. This is true also for semimodals. So whatever follows a modal or a semimodal is always going to be an infinitival or base form. So we can compare here the sentence on the bottom, I ate, is a simple sentence. But if I want to add a semimodal, I had to eat. Notice that the tense changes only on had to. Before it was have to, now it is had to. So that's how we can tell that the semimodal is what's carrying the tense here. So once again, if we kind of take a similar chart to what we saw with the modals, tense is going to move to the leftmost auxiliary, which may be a semimodal. And I want you to notice also that unlike modals, semimodals can actually be combined with other modals. Now, we cannot take two modals and put them together. I can't say I might, should go to school. That's ungrammatical. But we can combine a modal with a semimodal, which is what we see in this sentence here. He may wanna reconsider our position. Well, may is a modal, wanna is a semimodal, and we can put those two things together. So that's why we call this a semimodal, because it has some properties of modals in that it expresses obligation or hypothetical things, but it doesn't quite behave like a modal because we can add it to another modal. Normally, two modals would not be combined. So here again, we can see the tense is moving. If I just take a sentence, he reconsidered our position, the tense is carried on reconsidered. Now, if I add a semimodal, he wants to reconsider our position. Here, this is what's carrying the tense, wants to. And I know that because I can change wants to wanted to. We can add another modal. He may want to reconsider our position. May and might are what's carrying the tense in this case. And want to, notice, is frozen. It's in a base form. So we cannot say he may wants to reconsider our position, or he may wanted to reconsider our position. Cannot have the tense on the semimodal at that point, because we have this leftmost modal auxiliary that's carrying the tense instead. Okay, so that's it for modals and semimodals under conditional mood. We'll practice those sentences a little bit more. They're also on the Canvas page. So please make sure you take a look at that before you come into class on Friday. Have a great day, everybody.